Hello and welcome. My name is Stephanie Kunze. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Sociology here at Northern Arizona University. And I will give you a brief sample lecture from my Soc 215 Race and Ethnic Relations class. In this class, I talk about education and more specifically about Native American education in terms of federal off-reservation boarding schools, so assimilation through education. I will just share a few slides with you. So I'm going to jump back and forth so that you can see my slides, but that you can also see me in between. So one thing I want to highlight is the work of Dr. Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart. She's an associate professor in psychiatry at the University of New Mexico, and she presented at the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition earlier in 2020 and added to the conversation of truth and reconciliation. When we talk about truth and reconciliation, we talk about unearthing what has happened, what is going on, like what has led to a certain event. And then we move towards reconciliation, where we bring these two groups of people together at the table and try to have conversation, trying to move beyond what has happened. But Braveheart suggests in order to have reconciliation, we need to have healing first. So this means when we talk about historical trauma, which I will talk about in just a moment, we cannot just identify the facts and work through what has happened and then move straight to reconciliation. Instead, we need to allow survivors or victims to actually heal in order to be able to move towards reconciliation. So in these conversations, we often hear about inter or transgenerational trauma, we hear about historical trauma, and we also talk about the soul wound or blood trauma. Intergenerational and transgenerational trauma is really related to psychology, psychiatry, and historical trauma more often is used in social sciences such as applied indigenous studies or sociology. And these terms refer to the handing down of trauma from one generation to another. So an example would be if we have children who have to go to a federal off-reservation boarding school and they experience physical, mental, or sexual abuse, or are exposed to a lot of corporal punishment. When these children later on have their own families, they are more likely to use the same methods on their own children because they have never learned how to raise children other than how they have been raised themselves. So you see that there's a handing down of traumatic experiences from one generation to another. The term soul wound really comes out of critical race theory, and it refers to similar experiences as they relate to the descendants of slaves. So here we are looking at traumatic experiences that enslaved people have experienced and that are being passed on to their next generations or their children. Blood trauma is a term that we talk about more and more often. It is really related or similar to epigenetics. That is a field that Rachel Yehuda has done a lot of work in. She's a scholar who's researching the traumatic experiences of Holocaust survivors, Jewish Holocaust survivors, and how their experience, their trauma is manifested in their genetics, and that they pass on these genetics to the next generation. And one of the related outcomes that researchers such as Yehuda are seeing is that there is an increased likelihood for diabetes, for example. And we see a similar or the same kind of outcome in Native Americans. And there we use the term blood trauma, but they are very similar. Another term that I would like to explain just briefly is genocide. When we look at genocide, we are referring to the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, or short, the UN Genocide Convention. And it consists of 5 parts that stipulate what genocide is. And first of all, it refers to the intent, the governmental or policy intent to remove or kill a group of people. So we have intent, we have killing, we have the causing of serious bodily or mental harm, we have the deliberate inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, measures intended to prevent birth. Here you may think of sterilizations, or you may think of some of the policies we have observed in, for example, Australia, where Indigenous people were prohibited from having children with other Indigenous or Aboriginal people, or even non-Aboriginal people. And then the last one, forcibly transferring children of one group to another. A classic example here would be adoption. What was left out of the Genocide Convention, which is often referred to nowadays when we look at the experiences of Indigenous people, is ethnocide or cultural genocide. That was a part that was vetoed in the original proposal and did not get included when the UN Genocide Convention was ratified. And that refers to the removal of the means of survival, as well as history, culture, language, religion, ceremony, and social cohesion. So ethnocide or cultural genocide ultimately leads to the same outcomes as genocide does, but it's not through direct killing or removal or sterilization or even declared governmental intention. And when we look at Native American experiences, we find both. We find genocide, but we also find cultural genocide. I have a little quiz for you at home. If you want to review these 6 statements, which one of these sets cultural genocide or ethnocide apart from genocide? If you picked F, that is correct. So this is what describes cultural genocide or ethnocide. So when we talk about the federal Indian boarding schools, we are talking about schools that were built off reservation, far away from tribes' home nations. And there's a little bit of history behind it, how Captain Henry Pratt, coming out of the Indian Wars, moved into educating Native Americans, something I will talk about in more detail in my class. But when students or young children were sent to the boarding schools, they often arrived in their traditional garb, the way they were normally dressed. Once they came to the boarding schools, you would see these after pictures. So before and after pictures were really powerful at that time and often used to highlight successes. So in these after pictures, you will see the same person, but with a short European style haircut, with a different type of outfit, a more military uniform. And most interestingly, in these pictures, you see that the photographs had lightened skin. So the after pictures showed the same individual, but lighter. So those were ways that philanthropists or government officials were assured that this assimilation program, taking Native American students to boarding schools and teaching them how to be more European American and how to integrate into American society, was a success. Overall, the federal government ran 25 off-reservation boarding schools, and not all of these 25 were ever open at the same time. Some of them closed early or opened later. But ultimately, those 25 were run between 1878 and 1934. An example is Carlyle Indian Industrial School, which Captain Pratt opened and heavily lobbied for. That was like the flagship institution and the big test if these schools could actually help with assimilation. But we also had schools in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, in Haskell, which is now a university, Sherman, Phoenix, for example, Flandreau, and so many more. When we talk about boarding schools, we need to understand that there were also other types of schools. So the federal government ran a total of 25 of these off-reservation federal boarding schools, but we also had mission schools. These mission schools were run by different religious denominations. Then there were contract schools that were run by aid groups or other organizations that contracted with the US government, but they were not overseen or staffed by the US government. And we had a number of federally run on and off reservation day and boarding schools. So it was quite a large network of these schools in which students were whisked away and taught how to become Christians, how to live the European American lifestyle, how to work in the fields or in a shop. So they received vocational training predominantly. And on top of that, they received an education up to the 8th grade in reading, writing, and math. What we're finding out about nowadays is that there were many more boarding schools than we even knew about. There are tons of documents being discovered right now which show that there were schools all over the nation, all over the country that the government or that we didn't really know existed. So there's a lot of work being done in that area. So what did these schools do? And I have a slide for you to highlight that as well. So students, sometimes as young as 3 years old, were removed from their families, from their land, their culture, their language, their traditions, and their ways of life. They were taken to these boarding schools where they received, as I said, up to an 8th grade education and had to do a lot of labor, vocational work, or work in surrounding communities. For example, in Phoenix, the boarding school, the federal off-reservation boarding school was only opened because they promised the local people in Phoenix, and there were roughly maybe 2,000 inhabitants at that time, that the students would help them with the harvest. So the students would go out in their communities and actually perform labor for the community. So in this process, their ideals or their knowledge was replaced with European American ideals, with the English language, with the Christian belief, with clothing and appearance, and the knowledge how to live a Euro-American life. In between here, there was a lot of punishment. Students who were caught speaking their own languages or playing traditional games or engaging in some sort of ceremony were punished, often with corporal punishment. But there are also a lot of stories or evidence from survivors that there was a lot of abuse in many of these institutions. And these things combined are what is leading to the kind of trauma that we're dealing with today, that we're talking about when we talk about truth, healing, and reconciliation. Where are we today? We still have a number of dormitories across the nation. Some of them are old boarding schools, but nowadays the students go there because they are too far away from their schools. It's too much travel, or it is too much of a financial impact on the families, that they attend a dormitory or a boarding school dormitory, where nowadays they learn about cultural practices, they learn about their traditional religions, they learn about history, they learn about their languages, they're being taught how to eat or what kind of nutrition and food they traditionally were engaged in, and more. So that was just a short overview of what I talk about in my lecture. There's a lot more detail, a lot more background, and I would be very excited to see you in my classroom sometime and we can have this conversation much more in depth. So have a great day and hopefully I'll see you at NAU sooner or later.